I am forecasting a severe fun warning. So if you don't want to have a good time, you need to leave the program now because we've got all kinds of wonderful guests lined up who are going to be speaking and telling great stories and hopefully helping you negotiate those senior years. We're trying to do the same. Uh, Scott, I'm thinking back to when we used to work together every night. And what you may not know is after you went home, when we had some real winter storm warnings, and I was concerned about roads icing up, and oh, the worst thing that could happen would be if we had snow or ice overnight and the morning meteorologist wouldn't be able to make it in. That was my big fear. And so there were times when I spent the night at the station. I would take a sleeping bag and a pillow and a change of clothes. And here's the part you may not know. I would sneak into the sports office, which was dark. I couldn't go to the newsroom, that's busy all night. But in sports, it was quiet after midnight, and I could lay down. I used to lie down under your desk, Scott, and get a good night's snooze there, just to make sure I was ready if they needed me in the morning. But generally, the morning meteorologist was able to make it in without any issues. Now, I'm not the only weathercaster who is going to be presenting today. A little later, I think you're going to be hearing from Troy Dungan. And Troy, of course, a friend and a longtime competitor. What he may not realize, though, is that back when I was growing up in Houston, Troy was one of the weathercasters on KTRK, Channel 13, there in Houston. And I recall vividly the night he left to move, I believe it was up to Detroit he was going to. And when he left, he set off a smoke bomb in the studio, and when the smoke cleared, he was gone. So that was his goodbye from Houston, and I remembered laughing about that. I'm sure you're going to be hearing a lot more from Troy a little bit later. Now, most people who have done the weather, who have been in the weather business at any time, have a beginnings, an origin story about how they got into the business, what made us interested in the weather in the first place. Well, there are a number of things that led to that for me. Number one, my father was a geologist, so he was an earth scientist. And I was always fascinated. We would go on trips when we would take a vacation, and we'd pass a road cut, and he'd stop and pull over, and we'd all run out and look for fossils and shells and minerals on the side of the road where it had cut into the sediment on the side. And that was always fun. So I really learned from an early age that I enjoyed studying the earth, but not necessarily just the dirt and rocks and minerals. I was also interested in what was happening upstairs. Another thing that I really loved was just maps. My father had a bunch of them, and we had a big National Geographic atlas in our house, and I could sit there and travel the world, sitting in a chair in our living room and paging over one after another and looking at all of these exotic locations all around the world, hoping maybe someday I'll get to go to some of those places myself. So I had this great love of maps, a love of science. And then when I was about 9 years old in Houston, Hurricane Carla hit. Came in down south of Freeport, actually, but we had a big impact right there in the Houston area as well. We were in a rental house at that time before we had our full-time house built. It was in the process of being built. So our first year in Houston, we were in a rental, and I watched as fences came down, trees came down, shingles blew off the roofs. We didn't have major structural damage that far inland. We were in southwest Houston, but it still made a big impact on me. And from that time forward, I was fascinated by hurricanes. And this was, recall, way before the internet age. You couldn't go to a website and see what the National Hurricane Center was saying. The only way I could get updates on storms was to listen to the radio, because every 3 hours they would give the coordinates of a storm, the latitude, the longitude, the pressure, the wind, what direction it was moving, and I would since I like maps so much, plot those on a hurricane map in the Gulf of Mexico and watch as a storm was moving across and see if it would affect us. And so that just really led to my enjoyment of studying the weather. And eventually I set up a weather station in our backyard, and I would go out before school, after school when I got home, and then again before bedtime, and had a notebook where I would jot down the weather each day. And really, by the time I was in junior high, I was pretty convinced I wanted to be a meteorologist. Went to Texas A&M and graduated 4 years later. Had one semester of graduate school, and in between graduation and graduate school, I got to go to the Juneau Icefield Research Program up in Alaska. One of my first real adventure travels, where I spent 6 weeks up on the ice field. We would cross-country ski from one base to another, doing all kinds of research on meteorology, but also geology, glaciology, geophysics. It was just a fascinating summer, one of the best times of my life. I'll never forget that. But then I came back from that summer. I was sitting in a classroom again in graduate school. And at that point, I have to say, I was really tired of sitting in classrooms. I enjoyed school. I did well at it. But after that experience in the field, I was ready to get on with my life. I had a full fellowship for my master's program. But about halfway through that first semester, I got a phone call from a gentleman named Harold Taft. Now, I grew up in Houston. I had no idea who Harold Taft was. I learned real quick, though. But Harold called and invited me to come up to interview for a television job. Now, first off, you have to understand, I was extraordinarily shy. I hated getting up and speaking in front of people. It just made me nervous. Now, I could be in a play and play the part of someone else, but me standing up and talking just always made me quake. And so my senior year in college, one of the courses was public speaking. And I petitioned my counselor, can I take another semester of Russian instead of speech? And he said, no, if you want to graduate, you've got to take this. And so, big gulp, and I took the class and I made an A. I found out if I knew what I was talking about, if I was prepared, I could do it. It was just the uncertainty that scared me about getting up and speaking. But if I knew my subject, I could do it. So when Harold called, I said, all right, this is not the way I had my career planned. I was thinking of research, maybe going to Antarctica, studying climate. But this call came up and I said, what the heck? It'll be good experience interviewing for a job anyway. So I got in my old beat up 68 Falcon and drove up Highway 6 from College Station towards Waco on the way into the TV station in Fort Worth.